Good morning to everybody, and good afternoon to a couple of colleagues. Celia, maybe Israel will be connected. Thank you, everybody, for joining and your interest in this BBL. We have invited Matt and Kimberly from the Urban Institute so that they can talk. We can hear about the performance-based financing approach in the water and sanitation sector. As an introduction, I would like to mention three things very briefly. First is results-based or focus on performance has a great potential, and especially now that we're trying to innovate in how we seek results, how we achieve results, this has a great potential, say, when we want to embrace new technologies or when we want to promote social change. Secondly, there are interesting examples in the water and sanitation and hygiene sector. We'll briefly look at these examples during today's presentation. Third, what I found is once we start exploring, it might be easy to get lost. It's at times confusing. There are different modalities or types, and also there are different terminologies. So I thought it would help a lot to all of our colleagues if we could know the building blocks or key considerations in moving to work on these topics, such as who are the participants, who are involved, what role do they have, and among other things. So that's basically why we invited today's speakers, Matt and Kimberly from the Research to Action Lab of the Urban Institute. Matt is a policy manager. He has many publications. Just to name one, that's called Outcomes-Based Project Assessment Tool, which I found quite interesting, useful. And Kimberly coordinates capacity building activities by the Research to Action Lab. And she has extensive experience working with local governments and communities in several regions of the world, including LAC. So after the presentation, we will have enough time for Q&A session. This is an internal BBL, so I would like to open the floor to everybody to have an active discussion. We will invite many of our colleagues to participate. I expect many of you can participate in that Q&A. And before we end, I will pass the word to Sergio Campos, our division chief, for the closing remarks. That's the structure of today's session. So Matt and Kimberly, the floor is yours. Please go ahead with your presentation. And thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Kay, and hello everyone. I am just going to kick off today by talking about the agenda for the context of our presentation. Matt and I are both very happy to be here to talk to all of you about the things that we've learned in the field. So we're going to start out with some quick introductions. As Kay mentioned, there are many terms that are floating around in this field. So we'd like to spend some time unpacking what each of those terms mean and how we at Urban think about them. And then we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the applications in the WASH sector, and then talk about a few of the principles that we think are really critical in order to have effective PBF work. So Kay already did a quick introduction of both of us, so I won't dig very deep into that. Happy to share more about our backgrounds in the Q&A if you're interested, but I really want to advance and get into the meat of today's conversation. So taking a step back, just going to mention the Urban Institute and what we do and how the organization likes to think of themselves in the field. So Urban is a social and economic research organization. We are based in DC. Our primary work is we are charged to use evidence to inform change makers. So those change makers could be anyone from local, national government, community partners, anyone in the field that really wants to use robust evidence to inform their decision making. At Urban, we have 12 research centers. Those research centers are typically thematically based. So we have things like the Health Policy Center, the Justice Center, among many others. And we have about 500 plus employees at Urban. Matt and I are both based in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. And that is an interdisciplinary group. So unlike the other research centers, we cut across all different topics and sectors. And our prime goal is to be able to translate the research into accessible, informative ways that can better inform decision-making. The decision-making for government as well as for community. So for many years, the Pay for Success initiative was based in the Research to Action Lab. And that has been the introduction that Matt and I have had to this world of performance-based financing. So with the Pay for Success initiative, we had that as a knowledge hub for organizations and agencies who are interested in exploring this idea of performance-based financing. Very specifically, we worked with impact bonds. We tried to help organizations think if impact bonds were suitable for their work and if it could help them solve some of the community's challenges. So I want to do a quick poll just to gauge how much information people have. Oops, go back for a second. I'm going to do a quick poll just to gauge how much information people already have on performance-based financing. As we mentioned, there are numerous different tools. And so could you please click on all of the different terms that you are familiar with? You're either familiar, you have heard about it, it's something of interest to you. And I'm going to give folks about 30 seconds on this. Five more seconds before I close the poll. Okay. Fantastic. So it looks like we have a wealth of information in this performance-based contracting space. A few folks are familiar with conditional cash transfers, and then on the lesser side, but equally important, impact bonds. Well, the good thing is our presentation today will talk about all the different types. And so you'll get a flavor of each of them and get a little bit more depth in the ones that you might already be familiar with. So with that, I want to start out with some basic concepts just to get the what are these things, why, and how are they used. So starting off with some clarifying key terms. Oftentimes, there are many different words that are buzzing around and different ways that we can think about this type of work. When we think about performance-based financing, there are organizations that think about it as any of these three buckets you see at the bottom, the outputs, the outcomes, or the impact. At Urban, we typically ground our results in thinking about outcomes. However, there are other organizations that might think about it more as outputs. So for example, for results-based financing, we have a different understanding at Urban where we want to think of the performance as a type of outcome, but there are other organizations that might think about it differently. So for the rest of the presentation, when we talk about performance-based financing, we're really grounded in this idea of how do you get beyond activities and outputs and really get into that realm of what are the results, the outcomes look like, and how does that lead you towards impact? So in getting into the what is PBF? What is performance-based financing? There are some typical things that you can look out for some of these. Across the board, they all target or incentivize outputs and outcomes. So they're not activity-based. They're stepping up into the realm above that to think about what are some of these grounded features of these various projects that go beyond just the activities that are assigned in the contract. So some of the features that they might include are there's some type of payment that's associated with a measurement of results. And what those results look like are agreed upon ahead of the project. So the incentive structure is typically closely tied to motivate those results. For example, if there's a public safety project, the results should also, or the incentive should also be on public safety, not on another sector like education, unless there's an inextricable link that's being created between the different sectors. And as we saw in the poll and have been mentioning throughout the beginning of this presentation, there are numerous types of ways to think about this umbrella of performance-based financing. So you'll hear terms like results-based financing, performance-based funding, outcomes-based contracting, pay for success, impact bonds, etc. So there's a big question here of, okay, why are governments, why are communities, why are organizations interested in performance-based financing? And there are a couple of reasons for that. The main thing is there's this idea that you want to know what success looks like. It's important to understand what motivates stakeholders to understand how they'd like to see things improved. Then there's a second piece, which is how do you align incentives that you have in mind to the results? Then thirdly, it provides a mechanism for accountability. So if you are the government or if you're the community, you can hold someone accountable for these results that you'd like to achieve. It also builds in a framework for achieving impact, not just checking off a box for activities. And then there's this dual effort where the government can use these types of projects to motivate communities, motivate people on the ground. And at the same time, the community can use their involvement with these types of projects to hold the government accountable so that they can see changes on the ground where they are. Now, just to get in a little bit into some of the limitations of the tool, although it has all of these great promises of how do you align the work that you do to these results, to these outcomes, and eventually to these impacts for countries, there are some limitations that pop up. First of all, performance-based financing mechanisms, they are typically a little bit costlier than when a government executes a direct contract, and they're more complicated to finance. Later on in the presentation, I'll do a little description of what it typically looks like and what happens when you think about a performance-based financing framework. The second limitation is that you need some type of reliable data for the monitoring and evaluation. And that's important because you need to measure the progress and link that progress to the incentive, to the results, to the payout. Thirdly, because some of these things are very complex, there needs to be collaboration across multiple partners, multiple sectors. And that's both important to do the work, but also for the data. There are often times when we're tracking certain things that are related to performance-based financing because the person or the household is at the center of how you see success. That person and that household typically touches many different systems. And so in order to capture that, you need all the different system partners or government agencies to be on board to understand what that success looks like for each of them. And so it does require a certain level of collaboration. And then fourthly, sometimes it's challenging where you might see that the project incentivizes the wrong outcomes or the wrong behavior. And so the project might set out to do one thing, however, motivate the wrong thing. For example, we see here in the US, some of the projects in the early childhood education sector They really want to see that reduction in the amount of children or amount of youth that have to go into special education. But at the same time, you don't want to deny services to someone who really does need that special education program. And so these types of financing mechanisms need to be structured in a very particular way to ensure that you're not incentivizing the wrong behavior or denying services to people who genuinely need it. And then finally, it's sometimes not a good tool for every project. And being able to evaluate that early on as an organization and as stakeholders is really critical to the success and determining if it's right for the government or right for the community. So this table here just gives you an idea of each of the instruments that we mentioned before and how we think about them. So for the impact bonds, those are your social impact bonds that pay for success, your environmental impact bonds, development impact bonds. There are a whole range of them. The organization that has been coming in and providing the upfront capital for those are typically external investors. And they are very much focused on this outcomes framework. And then when we look at performance-based aid, that's where you look at your cash for delivery programs for results. The government is usually the primary agent there. And the type of performance also looks different. For your performance-based contracts, such as output-based aid, that's something that's usually grounded to the service provider, and it is measured, or the performance is measured, typically by outputs or activities. And very similarly for conditional cash transfers, also think about performance in the terms of outputs. However, households or individuals are really the ones who are being incentivized here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how business as usual operates and then how it looks different in performance-based financing. So typically, without using a PBF mechanism, governments are paying for services. That's what happens. They create a contract with a particular result in mind. And these might outline the activities and the outputs. However, very rarely do you see these government contracts outlining outcomes. Essentially, the government is bearing all the risk of if this is something that will be successful or not. And one reason why governments might not currently focus on outcomes is because it might take years before you get those results. And a service provider can't wait that long to get paid. And so that's why you don't typically see a type of relationship that's outcomes based when you see how governments typically fund or procure at the moment. Now, breaking this down, looking at the impact bond example, it looks a little bit different. You'll see that there are two new actors that are involved in the process on the right and left side of the diagram. The top and bottom remain the same. We see that there is an investor that's being introduced. And this is for the purposes of providing that upfront capital and offering the cushion to the government that would typically be paying for these services upfront. The service provider, as usual, will implement the program. An evaluator, and typically a third party or independent verification type of agent, is brought on board to measure the project impact, because then you lose that bit of accountability if you don't have a third party person coming in to check the accountability, to check if the results are really measuring up. And then if the project was proven successful by all of the criteria that these stakeholders have set into place, then typically we see that in impact bonds, governments will repay that initial loan, the upfront capital that the investors provided. And most often we see them adopting the program because they have proven that this is a program that moves the needle on whatever question they had or whatever improvement they'd like to see in their communities. And so they see that this is a good program if it proves with positive results and can adopt it, or if it does not prove with positive results. There are many lessons learned that can come out of this process. So as I mentioned, there are many different actors and it looks differently when we talk about performance-based financing. We have the typical government and service providers. And then we have these new actors that come into this space. We have the external funders that step into the space. These are typically investors. We see in results-based financing, for example, we see the development banks step into this space or with development impact bonds. And then we see these intermediaries that have, they're most often, but not always, included in these performance-based financing tools. So when these types of deals are being set up, they are pretty complex and they require certain calculations and levels of understanding how you pay out on results. And as a result, you might have a financial intermediary organization step up to the plate to really provide that understanding of how do you want to tranche out your success? How do you want to measure success? And how do you want to offer your repayments over time? Because often the repayments do not come in a bulk at the end of the time. You'll see tranches going out throughout the lifespan of the project as each of these milestones are achieved. The financial intermediary really steps into this space to make that happen. And then we've been seeing in this space, particularly in the US, the knowledge intermediaries stepping up. So I'll also mention that Urban does offer that role where the knowledge intermediaries, they're the ones who are sharing additional information on what does the evidence, what does the data look like? What does your baseline look like when you're thinking about building one of these deals? What does it mean in the space? How can you ensure that you have the right actors being involved? Things like that, the knowledge intermediaries, which sometimes the financial and the knowledge intermediaries might be the same organization, but sometimes they might be different. And then finally, we have evaluators, which is a really critical component of performance-based financing. There needs to be some way, if there are outcomes being measured, outcomes being achieved, there needs to be some way to verify that that's happening. And that's the role of the evaluator. And that's something where Urban has also been involved in the space for the past, I'd say about 6 years or so, where we've been called upon as an evaluation organization to evaluate some of these deals, particularly in the US involved with impact bonds. So that just gives you a landscape of the types of actors that are typically within some of these performance-based financing tools. So just to mention, there are some, a quick wrap up of some of the material that I just went through. I know that it was quite robust. So the funders are typically private investors, governments, donors, philanthropies. Anyone who's in that space, that's what these external funders typically look like. And performance, that's being incentivized, outcomes or outputs. Typically outcomes, but we do see outputs as well, especially for things like conditional cash transfers. And then the question on whose behavior is being incentivized, going back to the table that we showed before, it really depends on what your unit is. So for conditional cash transfers, it's really the household, but then for other types of tools, you might see service providers or government being incentivized for that behavior or for this change that we're seeing. And then that funding is either provided upfront or it can be reimbursed depending on the model. So I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's going to talk a little bit more about the WASH sector and share some principles.
Great, thank you. Buenos días a todos. Perdón, mi español es muy malo, así que hablar en inglés. Sorry, I just wanted to put that out there. I wish I could speak in Spanish for this. But I'm going to talk a little bit, as Kimberly said, about how performance-based financing has been applied to the WASH sector. I have to do the caveat, I'm not a WASH expert. I used to work at the World Bank on Central Asia water and energy portfolio, but still don't consider myself a WASH expert. So water and sanitation is definitely one of the sectors, development sectors, where performance-based financing has been used most often. The other ones include health and social services. Health is really where it took off compared with social services in more developed countries. So although there are many projects and development partners that say their projects focus on outcomes, they really are focused on outputs or at best intermediate outcomes. So for example, one development impact bond that's very popular, which will remain nameless, uses proxies for healthcare facility certification as their outcome indicator. It's certainly not an outcome. It's an important indicator, but it's not an outcome. So it's an important thing to distinguish between the two. Sometimes it does make some sense to focus on outputs within health, for instance, vaccinations are frequently used as the payable outcome or indicator for those projects. And within WASH, there's a lot of potential for using performance-based financing to incentivize improvements in, for instance, service quality and utility management. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides, but there's definitely a lot of untapped potential, in my opinion, in that space. And then looking at a little bit of the evidence about whether performance-based financing is effective or not, I think generally it's fairly mixed. What evidence exists within the WASH sector is positive, however. So there was a 2015 review that was conducted on behalf of the Gates Foundation. It found strong evidence that these types of projects in WASH are effective, but it didn't find enough evidence about are they efficient and are they sustainable? So that's still a bit of an open question. A more recent evaluation in 2019 of DFID's efforts for their payment by results program found that it was very successful at meeting the outcome targets that it set. So that's fairly positive and gives some evidence that tying payments to incentive or incentivizing performance by tying payments to it can potentially lead to good outcomes. The last thing I'll mention here on this slide is that there are a few instruments or variants that are particularly unique to the WASH sector in particular. As we discuss, environmental impact bonds focus on the environmental impacts of projects such as improved sewer systems leading to improved water quality in a jurisdiction. The second bullet, which is payment for environmental services, I'm sure some people have heard of that. That encourages good stewardship. For instance, downstream users of the water may provide payments to those upstream to maintain the quality of the water. And that really is an example of performance-based financing because you're linking performance to payments. And then finally, some programs, such as a World Bank project in Indonesia that comes to mind, have linked utility performance and improvements in performance, not just to funding, but to access to technical assistance, which is kind of unique and is I think, really well designed for helping utilities upgrade and improve performance in a sustainable long-term way. Next slide, please. So this is just a sample of some of the performance-based financing projects in WASH. I'll go through these fairly quickly, but I'm happy to discuss in greater detail at the end with, again, the caveat that I wasn't on the project team for any of these. So specific details on the construction I can't go into. And we're also happy to share the slides, I should say. So the first one here in Cambodia, this one is a pretty new development impact bond launched by the World Bank late last year in Cambodia. It provides about $10 million to develop rural sanitation markets in 6 provinces in Cambodia and links the payment to a certain number of villages, 1,600 total, becoming open defecation free by 2023. That's a really interesting new project, and it's an impact bond, so it has a slightly higher level of verification. The next, Washington, DC, this is DC Water. I believe Kay mentioned that you guys have already done a BBL on this particular project, so I won't go into depth on the mechanisms, but I will say a core element on this project, which is kind of unique, was that this is structured as a contingent payment. So not to get too far into the weeds, but that means there's some risk sharing between the investors and DC Water in this. So if the green infrastructure that's installed performs as expected, DC Water will pay the investors the stated interest rate on the bond, which is comparable to the long-term cost of funds. If the green infrastructure underperforms, investors will still get something, but they'll pay a little bit back into the project as sort of a fee. And if it overperforms, DC Water will give an additional amount. So it's really a sliding scale there depending on the performance, which is kind of unique. The next project, which Kimberly can actually probably speak to better than I can, is in Jamaica. It's part of the Jamaica Inner City Basic Services Project, also by the World Bank. So this had 2 performance elements. One was the provision of new waste collection trucks to the National Solid Waste Management Authority if they prove they provided regular and sufficient waste collection services. And the second were financial incentives, including bonuses, to individual environmental wardens, as well as community-based organizations if they separated, if the recyclables and organics that they separated met a targeted weight amount. So it was tied directly to performance, and also if communities around the facilities were kept sufficiently clean as determined by very specific mechanisms. Next one, Manila and Philippines. These two are very similar in how they operated. So in Manila, it was a public-private partnership that took over a large water utility that serves a large part of Manila. And although, you know, it was successful at expanding access, it became clear that poorer households couldn't pay in full. So these were output-based aid subsidies that were used to bridge the cost between what those households were able to pay and what the true cost of services were. So in total, about 30,000 connections were subsidized. Similarly, in Morocco, this was a project that worked with expanding water and sanitation services to poorer households in peri-urban areas. And it worked with both public and private utilities to do that, to expand that access as measured by the number of connections, as well as a measure of sustained access and service quality to those services. And the last project I'll mention is a little bit different. It is a $55 million program for results project of the World Bank. I think it was launched in 2014 and was one of the earliest program for results projects that the bank had. And these projects are with government. So it's not necessarily incentivizing service providers directly, it's incentivizing changes within the government. There's a really detailed matrix of the indicators and verifications that they used in the project documents. I'm happy to share a link to that. But suffice it to say, there were a number of disbursement linked indicators, DLIs, that the bank used in this project. These included things like the introduction of a new state water and sanitation law that received a certain payment at that point, which is more of a process indicator. But there were also things like preparing and enacting new regulations for the sector, and as well as measures of service quality and sustainability. Those were all linked to specific disbursement amounts over time. So next, I'll describe a few big principles that we found in our work over the years should help guide the development of effective performance-based financing projects. So first, there are a few key factors that every project should really keep in mind. And Kimberly touched on a few of these already. So first, is PBF a good fit? Does it make sense for this project, or is it being forced onto a project because it sort of looks good and sounds good and people pay attention to it? And I think people would be surprised maybe how many projects exist as performance-based financing, and they should not be performance-based financing. They just don't make sense, but they attract attention of government, of people within development finance institutions, of local authorities. For whatever reason, they become performance-based financing. So they may not be appropriate. It's really important to determine. Second is if the existing legal and procurement environment is sufficient to enable the instrument. So a lot of times, especially when it comes externally, you'll find that laws within the country don't really enable those performance-linked payments in place. And that can be a very lengthy process to get conformance between procurement laws and procedures and the instrument that's trying to be implemented. Some projects are delayed for years because you need to get that perfectly aligned. The next one is do you have the data systems in place to really measure and understand the performance? That's really critical in these projects. And finally, do you have the support of key stakeholders like utilities and crucially, government? So the active support engagement of government is too often an afterthought for projects, even though it's often necessary for both launching the project as well as sustaining the project and capitalizing and leveraging the gains of the project in the longer term once that project officially ends. So it's a really important step that we found is often missing in international development projects as well as domestic projects in the United States. So first principle, I think there are 5, so we can get through this fairly quickly. The first is, it's really critical to understand why performance-based financing is the right fit for a given project. As mentioned already, performance-based financing has a lot of drawbacks, especially that it's very costly and very time-consuming to structure these. Even in a fast case, it takes a year or longer to pull together the key elements and get agreement in most cases on these. So there needs to be a really strong rationale for why this is the right instrument and right approach to proceed with. For instance, if financial incentives are seen as the necessary and maybe only way to spur service improvements that are needed by the utility. The next principle is to be very explicit from the get-go about what you mean by success. So what is it with what you want the project to do? And what is it with all the stakeholders involved really want to see? Is it reducing downstream pollution? Is it strengthening utility management practices? Is it improving access, improving the quality of the services received? So there's many different things that might be important. It's really useful to try to focus on one key thing that gets all the stakeholders in agreement. This is what we want this project to do. And then once you have defined that success and you have everyone aligned around it, then you can start designing the project around that end goal. That's really, really important. And projects that define success while balancing financial sustainability with the social benefits have the best likelihood of long-term impact. So the financing side and the social and environmental impact side should be sort of balanced in a way to ensure that sustainability. So yeah, the next one is ensure there's a clear theory of change and identify which actions should and can be incentivized. So what this means is, and it sort of relates to the last two principles, once you've defined success, you need to think about who and what needs to be incentivized to get to that success. So for instance, if the goal is improving trash collection and the identified barrier is the trash collection agents are not meeting goals, underperforming, then there may be incentives that can provide bonuses for sustained increases in collection outputs. That might be appropriate. In other cases, it might be the government that needs to be incentivized to get that push through, as I mentioned before, in the Mexico project, really instituting new regulations that are appropriate for modernizing the wash sector. So next slide, please. This is about allocation of risk. So I mentioned with the DC water example, risk can be allocated in these projects across multiple stakeholders. The projects spread it across, that project in particular spread it across the water authority and investors, while other projects can tie certain service provider repayments or bonuses to identified targets. So performance-based contracting puts some of the risk on the service provider themselves. And when outsider investors are brought in, whether they be a philanthropy or whether they be a bank, which is the case often in development impact bonds, the more ambitious the project targets, the higher the risk and the less likely the project will meet those targets. And when that's the case, you better believe that the private investors are going to want a higher return. And so that really completely adjusts how much money is going to the project and how much money needs to be set aside for the investors. Not saying that that's not a good thing to do. It varies by project. But you may get in a situation where you see so much risk is on the investors that they say, I want like a 20, 30% return. And that may be too high for that form of financing. So the final principle that I'll leave with you with is the sustainability of the project. So is this something that can, if proven successfully, the government or the utility can continue to finance? Can the households and community members continue to benefit after the project ends? As you are all very well aware, I don't have to tell you as development professionals, donor projects aren't always sustained and have a limited long-term impact if that sustainability isn't taken into consideration. And I would argue for performance-based financing projects, that's multiplied. That's even more likely to happen because of the complicated nature of the arrangements. That adds a further barrier to the projects and to country ownership in many cases. So these projects there are three ways you can sort of go about that in these kinds of projects. The first is structure it as very limited in scope to achieve a very specific outcome. So maybe you want to incentivize the enactment of new regulations. And so you have very specific ties to that happening. And once that happens, you don't need that regulation implemented again and again and again. You just need it enforced. The second could be, the project could be constructed in a way that they sort of fade into sustainability, such as projects that focus on improving utility performance. And once that performance is improved to a certain level, then that utility may be able to be on a path of financial sustainability. So you don't really need the same payments in place. And the third option you have is if you have very strong buy-in from governments and they say, for instance, you demonstrate that this project is successful. After that happens, we're willing to step in and provide some of that subsidy ourselves because we see there's clear benefits to the community. So those are different ways you can go about that. So last thing I'll just mention really quickly is there's a bunch of different resources that exist on this. Of course, I have to mention us, Urban Institute. So we've developed a number of resources related to performance-based contracts and impact bonds in particular. And although our work is primarily focused on projects in the United States, we've also done a lot of international development work. And there are a lot of strong learning opportunities between domestic US projects and development projects, especially in the area of impact bonds. And we've, as Kimberly's mentioned, we've served in the past as knowledge intermediaries on a lot of projects, as well as evaluators on a lot of projects. The second, the middle area, GPRBA at the World Bank, it's probably the most prominent and best resource if you're interested in learning more about performance-based financing within the development field. They were formerly known as Global Partnership on Results-Based Approaches, or no, they currently are known as that. They were formerly known as the Partnership on Output-Based Aid, which you may still see a lot. So this initiative is hosted at the World Bank, and it provides support and funding for World Bank projects, but also does a tremendous job as a just general knowledge intermediary, putting a lot of good stuff out there. The third I'll mention is OECD. So they haven't done a lot on performance-based financing per se, but they've done a lot in the past couple of years on blended finance and private sector engagement on WASH projects in particular. And that's really important to understand how different types of financing can be stacked or blended together to catalyze specific types of outcomes. So that's really useful as a partner. And there's, this is no means exhaustive. There are other resources out there. Brookings, for instance, they've done a lot of work on development impact bonds. That's really useful. So I think that's the last slide, and we'll just pause there. See if you have any questions for us. Kay, I don't know if you want us to go into questions or if you want to have the concluding remarks first.
No, we have 30 minutes, so let's go to the Q&A. Any colleagues can participate.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, and thank you, Kimberly, Matt, and Kay, for the good presentation. I have a question regarding and you talk a little bit, Matt, about the sustainability, because for an entity like the IDB, the long-term sustainability is a key element, but the sustainability after, for example, a donor's disbursement, what is your lesson learned about this long-term sustainability after the donor's disbursement ends?
Yeah, it depends on the type of project. So the challenge of doing this presentation is talking about performance-based financing as one thing, and there's so many different variations. I would say for projects that require development action, or you want to incentivize development action, or the government is in some position to provide financial support once the project ends, having the government involved from the get-go, as soon as the ideation phase starts, has proven really useful, especially for impact bonds. Because for a lot of these projects, ideally, if they're successful and they show results, you're going to want to sustain them, right? You're going to want government to step in and say, I see the value in that. So it's tricky because there's so many factors you can't control. Political economy is one of them. financial availability, so the fiscal position of the country is another. But once you have the government sort of involved at the table from the get-go, you sort of help institutionalize some of this thinking and the value of having a performance-based financing project. Another thing that's useful for getting government on board is using PR and using media to promote the project as something innovative. So it's a double-edged sword because sometimes the focus is just on how innovative and great it is, and it distracts from like, what's the outcome? Like, what do you actually care about? But it can, especially in places where political leadership and buy-in is really important. In the United States in particular, it's so important for the political leader to be at the ribbon cutting, to be there when the project launches, and to be able to put out a press release. That sort of ties them and their administration to the project. But these are 5-year projects. You know, they go beyond administrations. So getting people within government as bureaucrats to see the value in it because they've contributed to designing the evaluation, for instance, is really important. I have a few additional thoughts. I don't want to like dominate on this particular question, but it's extremely important for the utilities. Like I mentioned, if you have a way that the incentive payments are tied to sustainable improvements in the performance of a utility per se, then that can be sustained. If it's sort of a one-off, you know, we're giving you bonus payments for doing X, Y, and Z, and then the payment dries up, that can't necessarily be sustained, but you've demonstrated that improvement can happen. And so then you have ratepayers say, I'm expecting that improved performance now. I don't want it to drop back down. So that's also very powerful.
Thank you, Matt.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, Clever.
Hi. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. You know, it's really. I wanted to say something like we have an instrument at the bank that's called a performance-based loan. And looking at your presentation, I think the performance-based loan was a hybrid between a performance-based contract and a conditional transfer because there were reimbursements. The gist of the mechanism was we allow the government to use their own systems, their own evaluation systems, and to construct, in the case of Chile, we did that, to construct a water and sanitation systems in rural areas. And we agree with them on the eligibility criteria, what can be financed, and the cost.
Clever. I think your mic is muted.
Okay, ready? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
You're back.
Okay, where was I? The base performance loan, which is basically—
You were mentioning about the one in Chile, in solid
okay,
waste and
thank
rural
you.
water.
I don't know what happened here. What we did was we agreed with the government. We're going to reimbursement and trenches. I think it was 20 million, and then they construct the systems. And they will audit firm will verify that the cost, the eligibility of the investments and the cost. And that seemed like a really good idea to work with a government like Chile, that they can use their own national system. They can do what they always do in terms of public investments. But we run into some problems. And the main problem is we think we can scale up and say, okay, it's going to cost you $2,000 per household. So it's going to be so many households. And the reality was, because the conditions were so different in different parts of the country, they often spend more money per household. So they came out, we couldn't recognize the investment. So my question is, when you do this performance-based contracts, you mentioned, the pricing is very important. But what happens when you get into a situation when you have a price but conditions change and then you have to adjust? How difficult that will be? We couldn't really adjust it well in our loans, and we run into a problem in terms of the outputs. We expected to do a certain number of systems or households that benefited, and we couldn't reach it. So we got into a problem. We weren't really achieving the results we say we want to achieve with that kind of money. which I think was the main. The other one is not, sometimes the government is not the best executive agency. And I read a lot about the base performance contracts. I haven't really found one defining evaluation that can tell me that base performance contracts with an external operator are more efficient or effective than utilities or government agencies executing the works. Do you have any experience with those two areas?
Sure, thank you. Sorry, go ahead,
it.
Matt. You should actually start, and then I can offer an example.
Okay, perfect. I can answer on the first one. So in terms of the flexibility, these contracts can be built in a number of different ways. You can build in that flexibility, for instance. We most often see that in terms of early termination clauses. So if partners see we've invested about a quarter of the funds and we just see the project design is wrong. It's just not gonna, everyone agrees it's not gonna work. So early termination clauses are usually built in so the parties can amicably disperse. And it's important upfront to say what happens to the money then, like who's on the hook for all that money, because I've seen a couple bad situations where people get very angry and say, I shouldn't be responsible for it, you should be responsible for it. So having that sort of negotiated upfront is really, really important. I think having the differentiation in the costs across different regions is also important. I mean, most of the time we see projects in a specific region or sub area of a country. So the project in Mexico was Oaxaca, and in, say, the United States for impact bonds, it's a certain county or state, so they can very, fine-tune the cost analysis and the cost-benefit analysis in that place. So it's a combination of the work you do at the front, how wide the scope is for the project, and then building in those mechanisms for, maybe a year in, you agree to readjust their requirements. But that, I don't know enough about how IDB's processes work, if that can be allowed into a contract that you guys have and how you renegotiate some of those terms.
Yeah, I think just to kind of follow up on that, I'll give an example from the Jamaica results-based financing for solid waste management project. It's actually called Super 18 for short, because there are 18 communities. And bearing in mind this level of flexibility that's sometimes needed, where the government may need to go back and do cost adjustments. What they did for this project was, although it was all the incentives were tied to results that were based on waste collection, specifically trash, they also had some flexibility where they could include recycling if they wanted, but recycling was not tied to the payment. So the payments were all on the trash side and not on the recycling side, but the communities were educated about both. And I'm mentioning this because it was really important, because the second year of the project, the cost of plastics decreased on the market, on the worldwide market. And so the government no longer was incentivized of receiving a profit by bailing plastics off the island. And so we saw this challenge coming into play, where we are asking these communities and educating them on why it's important for both effective trash and plastic collection, but at the same time, the financial incentive is no longer there for recycling. And so in the middle of the project, in year or two, they were able to do these conversations with the government to reassure that the payments were only tied to trash, not to plastics, but the education, the channels that were being created with the local community would be sustained, because that educational component was also critically important for sustainability. And so there are ways in which, depending on how the indicators are defined, you can think about where there's flexibility to do things like cost adjustments, or at least adjusting what the goal might look like in the middle of the project.
Okay, I know there's still a hand up, but I think you want to have a couple minutes for closing remarks. I mean, we're happy to answer any additional questions if you email us or afterwards.
Yeah, let me, the time is coming to close, but I'll pass the word to Sergio Perez first. He's been raising hands, so that's the last question, and we'll move on to the closing remark by Sergio Campos, please.
Hello, Matt and Kimberly. Yeah.
Hi, Sergio Perez.
Yeah. Hello, Matt and Kimberly. Thank you very much for the presentation. when we are preparing in a project to improve water management, it's quite common to have very poor quality initial information. That is during the phase of the preparation of the result-based contract. Usually it's during the execution, after a few months, that we realize, for example, that the non-revenue water is not 30%, as was established by the commercial department, but more about 50%. Then, and it's our experience, for example, in the San Cristobal project in the Dominican Republic, one of the first results is having good quality data. Then I think that sometimes we can prepare a results-based contract that the first result is going to be the baseline. What do you think? What is your experience about that?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I haven't necessarily seen, I mean, projects have included information, improvements of information as indicators. So the Oaxaca project included information, but that was more information sharing to the community about, you know, performance. I haven't seen projects have the first phase be develop those systems, but I think that sounds like a great idea. If you're able to build a financing mechanism that's that flexible and says essentially, once we get this first phase done and there's a payment to do that, then the next phase, we all come together and we ensure, okay, this is the baseline, what do we want to achieve? And then we can do phase 2 and phase 3, whatever it is. I think that's a great idea. I haven't seen that personally in place. Usually you expect that work to be like pre-work, preparation work. But you know, it's expensive. It takes a lot of money and time, and it's a really, really important step. So if you do that, I would very much support you.
Yeah, and I'll also like to kind of follow up in agreement with Matt. I think this is sort of the space where we've seen intermediaries, both knowledge and financial, stepping up. So oftentimes these intermediaries have technical assistance, pro bono work that they can do. And so I know, like within urban, we did that under the Pay for Success initiative, but this real idea of how do we start to develop robust data systems so that when you start out the project, you feel like you're equipped to adequately measure.
Okay,
Hi.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to pass the word to Sergio Campos, please.
Thank you very much, Kay, Kimberly, Matt. Thank you very much for the presentation, for the time. Really enlightening, very well structured, in a subject that it's fascinating for us as bankers, as developmental bankers. No, in the water and sanitation, as most of my colleagues know, there's a huge need to increase financing. Our estimate is that in Latin America we would need to invest $15,000 million per year if you want to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So that's a huge amount of money, and the lending or the sovereign lending won't be able alone to do it, and governments will need to addition resources in order to achieve this. So moving from the performance-driven loans to the performance-driven financing, it's very important. Being able to capture the interest and mitigate the risks of impact investors, social investors, private investors, and so on and so forth. It's very important. No, and in that sense, I think that output-based contracts and performance-based financing will definitely play an important role. I really like the 5 conditions that Kimberly laid out, and that then Matt explained through examples. In terms of cost, it can be a little bit more expensive at the beginning. It's a little bit more complicated to structure, and it's very difficult to estimate the true cost of the output of the result. But it's worth giving a try. As Sergio Perez mentioned, data and baseline are key. I mean, if you don't have a good baseline, it's very difficult to pay for result because you need a baseline. So sometimes the baseline takes a while to be built, but it's worth building it, of course, no? And it's always a collaboration, a collaborative effort between either the public utility, the municipality, the households, the lenders, and everybody, no? So there's an ecosystem that needs to be built, and sometimes we ended up identifying the wrong outcome, sometimes because the data for the baseline is not there. But out of the 5 that you mentioned, the one that I think it's the most important for me is that this is an excellent tool, but not for all the projects. There are projects in which this can be very successful and very good, but there are others for which this is not well suited. As Clever mentioned, in the bank we had experiences on performance-based lending in Bahamas, in Jamaica, in Peru, and in Chile in 2 projects. And one of the biggest lessons learned was there are areas in which we can do performance-based lending because we have the data, we have the baseline, we know the indicators. So it's easier to do it as opposed to others that are of more complex engineering or more complex design. Of course you can do it, but the challenge of implementing, it's more. And with that, thank you very much for your presentations. Kay, thank you very much for organizing this. I think that there's more to review and more to learn. Really interesting publications that you showed us there. We'd love to have the links and be able to learn a little bit more about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt and Kimberly, and thank you very much all for your participation. I hope it was interesting for you. Thanks. Have a good day.